All right, everybody, Paul Stecewycz here, Weeks Aircraft, doing a mechanics corner on the 108 project. We're going to do the end of the year little update here. Basically, what we're going to talk about is a control system, the tail wheel inspection, and also going to talk about cleaning up a part and also explaining how I kind of learned how to do all this when I was a young kid. So stay tuned. Well, the first thing we're going to talk about is actually some information that I got from everybody on the last episode. We were talking about this piece, which is the gear that runs the gear up and down on the 108, and it has this pin that holds the gear in place. And my question was wondering why all these holes are in this pin. Well, of course, everybody saw the video. And actually, I learned something from everybody, because I didn't know what these were here for, but I had a lot of good responses, and they answered the question for me. And the reason, of course, that this is in here is that this pin actually has an eccentric portion on the pin. And when you put this in place, what this is for, all these different hole alignments, is to adjust it for wear in the worm gear. So, of course, as the time goes by, this wears a little bit, the worm gear wears, and you can actually adjust that play between the worm gear and this piece using this eccentric bolt. So that's what that's for. And what's interesting is it has this big open slot here that we had the bolt in. If you actually put it into one of the other holes, it actually locks it up completely. So they actually gave you a lot of leeway here to adjust that place. So thanks for the information. Not only you guys learned from me, but I learned from you too. So appreciate the input. Next thing we're going to talk about is the controls on the 108. The airplane has a very unique control system, and I'm talking about the rudder, ailerons, elevator control. And on the 108, we're going to talk about the rudder system. And what's interesting about this airplane is that there's no cables in the aircraft. The only cable in the airplane is the trim cable that runs the elevator up and down. Everything else is all rods, which is really a really nice way to do it. I've worked on some other airplanes that have this system, but the 108 really takes it to the next level. And it's interesting because, first of all, we have the rudder main bar right here, but actually bolts to the floor of the airplane. And what's interesting about these two pieces is they're actually chrome plated, and the chrome plating is all flaking off in places. So we're going to have to make another trip to the chrome plating shop to get those redone. Interesting that they did this because they're visible, but they're not that visible on the airplane. So I don't know why they went to that degree to chrome plate those, but they did. We've taken all these components out of the airplane to inspect them, and it's a very interesting system. Like I said, it has two separate bars right here. These bars are attached to a single column that goes through the center of the airplane that has a bearing on it. These pieces all ride on the bearing. And of course, the rudder pedals themselves, which are here, these cleaned up really, really nice. These are aluminum pieces. They were polished out before, and I gave them a little bit more cleanup. These pieces actually bolt to the little arms right here. And on top of some of those, on the pilot side only, there's a secondary piece that runs up here, which is the brake that runs the master cylinder to stop the airplane. These pieces came all out. Again, no cables. All this linkage goes right down to these really ingenious, the way they designed all this. It goes down to these separate little blocks and bearings. All that information on the rudder pedals is transmitted to a torque tube. That torque tube is attached to this piece, which actually is on the front of the spar. That is transmitted back into a larger tube. This runs all the way underneath the pilot and co-pilot seats. And then, of course, this end here has two rod airings at the end. And in the very back of the airplane, that is transmitted to a bell crank, which is here, which is a beautiful piece. It's all cleaned up, just gorgeous. And then attached to that is actually another, not so much a rod, it's actually like a really thick wire. And that wire rod runs all the way back to the tail and activates the rudder. And so, again, a very genius system, beautifully engineered. We found no damage in any of these pieces, so these are all going to get cleaned up, go back into the airplane. Those have to be chrome plated, like I mentioned earlier. But very happy with the way all that came out. Next thing we're going to talk about is the aileron and the elevator control system. All right, here we are with the aileron and elevator control system. And again, it's similar, like the rudder. being that there's no cables. We have here the pilot's control stick. This piece right here attaches to this main rod. The control stick actually sits in there like that, and these other holes right here are attached to another torque tube, and when you move this back and forth, that torque tube is transmitted that motion to a larger torque tube that goes back into the airplane and controls the elevators. And what's just interesting about this part is it has these two stops here. And this is actually controls the elevated travel. A lot of times they would put a stop on the control surface itself or on the stick, but in this case they put it on this torque tube. And basically this rides back and forth inside the airplane, and this piece, which is a phenolic piece, is bolted inside the airplane, and it just sits like that. And as you move it back and forth, this is what stops or controls the elevator from going too far in either direction. That's the elevator. Now the aileron portion of it, if you have the stick, it's attached to this part, and as you move this back and forth, the stick back and forth, this piece is riding back and forth inside the airplane like this. And again, this has stops right here. You see these two pieces, and this actually has inside the airplane there's actually a stop. So when this goes back and forth, it controls the distance that the ailerons travel. Unfortunately, as we took this part out of the airplane, we found that it is damaged. If you look very, very closely at it, it's bent. It starts out this way, and it starts slightly being bent out that way. Also, at this end, there is another rod that runs out there like this, and then on the end of that rod is a threaded piece, and this piece is also bent on the end. Now, a lot of people say, wow, that took a lot of force to do that. Well, again, I think this is another victim of the ground looping incident. I believe the airplane probably, when it went through its ground loop, the aileron on probably the left side probably got pushed maybe beyond its limits, and it transmitted that load all the way back through, and it found the weakest point, and the weakest point is this rod right here on the rod end. Even some of the bolts that held these pieces in were bent. So that took quite a bit of force to actually do that. So we're going to try to source another one of these because there's really no way to repair this. This tube is bent. You'd have to disassemble the whole thing and make a new tube. That could be an option, but we're going to try to source another piece before we do that. And again, the rod end also, we're going to have to probably find somebody that has a spare piece because there's no repairing that. If you could try to straighten that out, you're just going to weaken it even more. That elevator torque tube, again, goes back to the airplane, and it again is attached to a bell crank, just like on the rudder, another beautiful piece. And then again, like the rudder, it has a series of wire cables that attach to it that run all the way back to the tail and attach to the elevator, and that's what makes all this work. Very, very ingenious system, very well engineered. Again, unfortunately, we did find some damage there, but we're going to rectify that and get that all taken care of. Another thing we discovered along the way, we've been taking the gear all apart, the landing gear, the main gear, so I decided, well, let me look at the tail wheel. And initially, the tail wheel looked pretty good, but as I took it apart, we found all kinds of things wrong. The first part is the main tail wheel yoke, and I started taking this, took the tail wheel off of it, which is right here, and I was already suspect because this is not even a German tail wheel, so I was like, well, that's kind of strange. Then as I looked at this piece, I could see that it had been welded. These pieces had been formed, and somebody welded this all back in here to fit that tail wheel. Well, after doing a little bit of research, we found out that at some point in this airplane's career, it's actually in the logbook, and some people also told me about this, there was an incident where the airplane took off and the tail wheel fell off. And that just got lost somewhere along the line. Of course, they had to land the airplane, and when they landed the airplane, they probably landed it on the fork, and they damaged the fork and ground it all down. And so at that point, they probably couldn't find an original piece, so they decided, well, let's just take this piece and modify it to fit an American tail wheel. So that's what they did. So basically, this whole end of that is junk. Then we talk about the ground loop. The tail wheel was involved in the ground loop also, and if you look closely at the piece, it's actually bent right at this point. There's a big bump right here, so this thing was kind of torqued or twisted, and it kind of distorted that whole thing. So that whole thing is junk. There's also another piece that attaches to this, and it slides on top of here like this. This piece had a repair made to it because this is cracked from here all the way down to here, and somebody actually put this collar on here to deal with that crack. So that piece is junk. And then inside of all that, there's a big spring. The spring, of course, gives the tail wheel some shock absorbent qualities. Beautiful piece right there. Well, guess what? A victim of the ground loop incident. The very end of this that the bolt attaches that actually holds it onto the airplane was broken off in the accident, and then somebody did a horrible job of welding that back on. So guess what? That's junk. So what we found out is the tail wheel, all the components to the tail wheel, every bit of it is not usable. So we're going to have to source another tail wheel. I've already looked into that. I talked to some people. I think we might have to go with a later tail wheel. There was a different version on some of the French-built airplanes. They went with a beefier tail wheel that had a set of scissors on it that actually made it a more stable tail wheel. So we'll probably end up maybe going with that, because trying to find the original early style is probably going to be kind of hard. I'm going to try to find one, but I think we're going to have to go with the later style. So kind of gives you an idea how sometimes you can take apart and it's just like, well, this is going to be a piece of cake. And you take it all apart and you find out that it's all junk. Now, on the flip side of that, sometimes it just, some of this goes very quickly. And a good example of that is the pilot's control stick. We took it out of the airplane, cleaned all the paint off the bottom of it here to check for cracks. And we're going to polish this thing up, because this, of course, in a lot of photos I've seen, this stick was actually polished aluminum. So we're going to clean this thing up, and we're going to show you that sometimes a lot of this is very quick and easy, and sometimes very gratifying. So let's go check it out. Let's go polish this piece out. All right, here we are in the welding shop where we have some of our grinding and buffing equipment. Have a simple electric buffer here with two different buffing wheels on it. And basically what we're going to do, we're going to just turn this thing on. We're going to start out with some, they're called jeweler's rules. This is what they use to buff out gold and silver and all kinds of different metals. And I actually learned how to do this. For one time, I was an apprentice. A long time ago. I was actually going to become a jeweler at one point, but then I decided I'd rather work on airplanes. So I have a lot of experience buffing out jewelry, so it kind of pertains to this. Buffing wheel is just a little cloth piece that's attached. So let's turn this thing on, get some material on there, clean this thing up. As you can see here, as you're polishing it, the jeweling rouge is starting to work out all the nicks and imperfections. Here I'm going to go to the second wheel, and I'm going to put on a different, a more finer jeweler's rouge, and this gives you a better final polish. And then when you get to the final polish, you can see how the shine comes up on the aluminum tube. We got a quick wipe down here. Kind of gives you an idea. Cleaned it pretty quick. It's a messy business though. Get it all over your face and stuff while you're doing this, but you can even, like I said, I was polishing actually the handle, which is it's like a composite material. I have to go over that a little bit more, but the buffer even was able to clean some of the scratches and stuff out of that. particular part, but that kind of gives you an idea. And sometimes doing some of this actually goes pretty quick. So a little bit more sanding here, and here's a few little nicks in it that have to be cleaned up, but you can see that didn't take very long, 5-10 minutes, and basically ready to go back into the airplane. So sometimes some of this is not that hard, and this is a good example of that. All right, everybody, on the last episode we talked about many things that it takes to actually do this, talking about patience and persistence and just learning how to put things together. And a lot of people ask me a lot of times, how did I learn how to do a lot of this stuff? Well, what's interesting is I actually started learning this when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And you probably wonder, well, how could that be? Well, I actually learned how to do all this by building plastic models. Now, some of you younger people out there might not even know what a plastic model is, but I started out building these right here. And this is an old Revel kit, P-47 Thunderbolt, which was one of my favorites. And a lot of people say, what are you talking about? This is not the same as building a real airplane. Well, it is, because basically you look at the box and the first thing it gives you is a goal. That's the goal. You got to take all the pieces and you have to make it look like the box. And on that subject, the box art on these things is just amazing. I love the P-47 one. So if you open it up, it teaches you all kinds of things. First thing it teaches you is how to follow directions. And that's important. You know, you go through here and it tells you how things go together. It teaches you hand-eye coordination. It teaches you how to prep parts, researching history, markings. And so it's actually the same thing. And you look at all these, you know, parts and pieces that come out of a kit, and it looks basically like a real airplane. There's all the parts. You have to figure out where all this goes. You have to figure out how to fit, how to test fit things together. So that's how I learned to do this. And I started building model airplanes because I started watching a TV show called Black Sheep Squadron. There's a lot of people that were influenced by this TV show. It had Robert Conrad playing Pappy Boyington, who was a Corsair ace in the South Pacific, and that show was just fascinating to me, and from there I just went crazy. In fact, one of the first kits I built was the Revel 132 scale Corsair, which has the best box art ever done. I wish I could find like a giant poster of that piece right there. So it's pretty cool. And of course, I don't have just these two kits. I've been collecting some of these over the years. I have quite a few more of these kits. We're here in my office. Check it out, man. I think I'm going to be busy. I've been collecting these because I figured when I get to be like 80 years old and I'm in a nursing home and I got nothing else to do, I could build plastic models again as a kid. So not only do I have a problem collecting plastic model airplanes, I collect a lot of other things. This is my office here, and it's filled with tons of books and models and cars and airplanes that I've finished over the many years that I've been doing this. I also collect American Flyer trains. I have some of that stored here because I don't really have any room for it at home. I also collect some of the 1/18 scale larger plastic Ultimate Soldier kits, old radios, all kinds of different things. My office is a bit of a mess, but it's an organized mess, and I really enjoy spending time here. And so anyways, everybody, that's the end of this year. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Hope everybody has a Merry Christmas, and we'll see you next year.